In the early hours of July 1984, a peaceful summer night in the small town of Elk City, Oklahoma, was shattered by an unthinkable act of violence that would leave the community reeling. Layla Cummings, a vibrant and joyful 7-year-old girl, was asleep in the modest apartment she shared with her mother. Her mother, working a night shift to provide for her family, had left Layla in the care of trusted neighbors, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Layla's abduction was as sudden as it was chilling. In the dead of night, Richard Norman Rojam Jr., her mother's ex-boyfriend, broke into the apartment. He had a history of violence and a criminal record, yet no one could have predicted the depths of his depravity. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Layla was gone, whisked away into the darkness by a man she had once known as a part of her family. When Layla's absence was discovered the following morning, panic set in. The neighbors, initially believing she might have wandered off, began searching the apartment complex and surrounding areas. When they realized the gravity of the situation, they contacted the police. The search for Layla quickly became a community-wide effort, with neighbors, friends, and local authorities scouring the town and countryside for any trace of the little girl. Flyers were distributed, and her face was broadcast across the local news stations. People clung to the hope that she would be found safe and returned to her mother. The investigation quickly zeroed in on Richard Rojam. Witnesses reported seeing a suspicious figure near the apartment complex that night, and his history of abusive behavior toward Layla's mother made him an immediate person of interest. Rojam's troubling past, including prior convictions for rape and his volatile relationship with Layla's family, raised red flags for investigators. The police wasted no time in questioning him, but his responses were evasive and uncooperative, fueling suspicions that he was involved. As the hours turned into days, the hope of finding Layla alive began to dwindle. The discovery of her lifeless body in a field near the town of Burns Flat was a devastating blow. She had been brutally assaulted and left to die, her small frame bearing the marks of unspeakable violence. The details of the crime were so horrifying that they shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The once vibrant child, known for her love of drawing and playing with friends, had been silenced in the cruelest way imaginable. The community of Elk City was plunged into mourning. Candlelight vigils were held in Layla's memory, and her tragic story dominated local news for weeks. Parents held their children closer, grappling with the horrifying realization that such evil could exist so close to home. Layla's mother was inconsolable, burdened by guilt and despair over the loss of her daughter. The crime scene itself became a focal point for investigators, who worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to Layla's death. Evidence collected from the area and Rojam's vehicle eventually confirmed his involvement. His capture brought some relief to the grieving community, but it could never undo the tragedy that had unfolded. This single act of violence left an indelible scar on Elk City, a town unaccustomed to such brutality. Layla's story became a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the capacity for cruelty that lurks in the shadows. The search for justice had begun, but for Layla's family and the tight-knit community, the emotional wounds would take far longer to heal. Richard Norman Rojam Jr.'s past was a dark tapestry of violence and criminal behavior, creating a chilling profile of a man capable of unspeakable acts. Long before the horrific events of 1984, Rojam had already established a pattern of predatory behavior that made his eventual crime against Layla Cummings all the more devastating. His history provided a harrowing insight into the mind of a man who had repeatedly displayed a willingness to harm others, especially the vulnerable. Born and raised in the Midwest, Rojam's early life was marked by instability and trouble. While details about his childhood remain sparse, those who knew him during his formative years described him as a volatile individual, prone to outbursts of anger and a penchant for defying authority. These traits only intensified as he reached adulthood, and by the time he was in his late teens, he had already begun exhibiting signs of deeply troubling behavior. Rojam's criminal record began in earnest in the 1970s. In 1978, he was convicted of raping 2 teenage girls in Michigan. These were not crimes of opportunity, but calculated and deliberate acts of violence. His victims, terrified and traumatized, came forward to ensure he faced justice for his actions. The details of the assaults painted a grim picture of a man who preyed on the weak, using manipulation and force to satisfy his depraved desires. Rogam's conviction led to a prison sentence, but he served only 4 years before being released. For many, this leniency would prove to be a tragic oversight, as it allowed him to commit far worse crimes in the years to come. Upon his release, Rogem returned to society, but any hope of rehabilitation was quickly dashed. His behavior remained erratic and dangerous, and he struggled to hold down steady employment or maintain stable relationships. By the early 1980s, he had entered into a tumultuous relationship with Layla Cummings' mother. While the relationship initially appeared unremarkable, it quickly became clear that Rogem was abusive and controlling. He displayed little regard for Layla or her mother's well-being, using intimidation and manipulation to maintain his grip on the family. Those close to Layla's mother would later recall warning signs that Rogem posed a serious threat. He had a history of verbal and physical abuse, and his temper often flared unpredictably. Despite these red flags, Rogem remained in the family's life for several years, forming a bond with Layla that, while superficial, masked his darker intentions. To the outside world, he appeared to be an unremarkable man, a description that made his later actions all the more shocking. When Layla's mother eventually ended the relationship, Rogem's behavior became even more erratic. He harbored resentment and anger, viewing the breakup as a personal slight. Friends and family of Layla's mother later reported that Rogem would show up uninvited, making veiled threats and attempting to regain control. This obsessive behavior culminated in the events of July 1984, when he took the ultimate step in exacting his twisted revenge. Rogem's criminal past was a critical element in the investigation into Layla's disappearance and murder. As soon as authorities identified him as a suspect, his prior convictions for sexual assault came to light, casting a long shadow over the case. Investigators knew they were dealing with a man who had not only demonstrated a propensity for violence, but also a complete lack of remorse for his actions. His history revealed a chilling escalation in behavior, from sexual assaults in his youth to the premeditated kidnapping and murder of a child. Psychologists and criminal experts who later studied the case pointed to Rogem's profile as a textbook example of a predatory offender. His ability to blend into society while harboring such malevolent tendencies made him especially dangerous. He had learned to mask his intentions, manipulating those around him to gain their trust before striking. The revelation of Rogem's past crimes sent shockwaves through the community of Elk City. Parents who had been following the case closely were horrified to learn that such a dangerous individual had been living among them. His prior convictions raised questions about the justice system's ability to protect society from repeat offenders, a debate that would continue long after his eventual sentencing. For Layla's family, the knowledge of Rogem's past added another layer of anguish to their grief. The idea that a known predator had been allowed into their lives was a devastating reality to confront. Rogem's history became a central theme in the prosecution's case against him, highlighting the deliberate and calculated nature of his actions. It also underscored the tragic reality that Layla's murder might have been prevented had Rogem remained behind bars after his earlier crimes. In the end, Rogem's past served as a grim reminder of the enduring consequences of unchecked violence. His ability to move through life with little accountability for his actions had ultimately led to the loss of an innocent child. His history of predation and abuse painted a stark picture of a man who had long been a danger to those around him, culminating in one of the most shocking crimes in Oklahoma's history. The trials and appeals that followed Richard Norman Rogem Jr.'s arrest for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 7-year-old Layla Cummings were complex, emotionally charged, and marked by both legal intricacies and the unyielding pursuit of justice by Layla's family and the state of Oklahoma. This chapter in the case reveals the challenges of navigating the justice system while ensuring that the perpetrator of such a heinous crime faced the full weight of accountability. Following the discovery of Layla's body in a field near Burns Flat, Oklahoma, authorities swiftly turned their attention to Rogem as the prime suspect. Evidence collected at the scene, including forensic data linking him to the crime, was damning. Witness statements further corroborated the suspicion that he had been near the area where Layla was abducted on the night of the crime. His criminal record, which included prior convictions for sexual assault, only solidified the case against him. However, bringing Rojem to trial was just the beginning of a long and arduous legal journey. The first trial began in the mid-1980s, with the prosecution presenting a strong case built on physical evidence, expert testimony, and the chilling timeline of events that tied Rojem to Layla's abduction and murder. The trial was emotionally charged, with Layla's family and community members filling the courtroom. Prosecutors painted a harrowing picture of Rojem as a predator who had manipulated his way into Layla's life, ultimately betraying the trust of a family who had once considered him part of their circle. The jury was presented with graphic details of the crime, a necessary but painful step in ensuring that justice would be served. The defense, however, sought to challenge the evidence and portray Rojem as a victim of circumstance. His attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and questioned the reliability of certain forensic techniques used at the time. Despite these efforts, the jury was unconvinced. Rojem was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death, a decision that was met with relief and a sense of closure by Layla's family. However, this initial victory was short-lived. Rojem's defense team quickly appealed the verdict, citing procedural errors during the trial. They argued that aspects of the jury selection process and the presentation of certain evidence had violated his constitutional rights. The appellate court agreed with some of these claims, overturning the death sentence and ordering a retrial. This was a devastating setback for Layla's family, who were forced to relive the horrors of the case as it was reopened. The second trial unfolded much like the first, with the prosecution once again presenting compelling evidence of Rojem's guilt. This time, however, the defense leaned heavily on psychological evaluations, claiming that Rojem's mental health issues should preclude him from receiving the death penalty. They argued that his actions, while heinous, were influenced by factors beyond his control, attempting to paint him as a deeply troubled individual rather than a cold-blooded murderer. Despite these arguments, Rojem was once again found guilty and sentenced to death. Yet the appeals process continued. Over the years, his legal team filed a series of motions challenging everything from the admissibility of evidence to the conduct of prosecutors. These appeals were often technical in nature, focusing on procedural issues rather than the substance of the case. Nevertheless, they succeeded in delaying Rojem's execution for decades, creating a prolonged legal battle that tested the patience and resolve of everyone involved. Throughout these trials and appeals, Layla's family remained steadfast in their pursuit of justice. They attended every hearing, sat through hours of testimony, and faced Rojem in court multiple times. For them, each appeal felt like a reopening of old wounds, a painful reminder of the daughter, sister, and niece they had lost. Yet they refused to give up, determined to see Rojem held accountable for his actions. The case also drew significant attention from legal scholars and advocacy groups. Some questioned the use of the death penalty in cases involving mental health claims, while others pointed to the repeated delays as evidence of the inefficiency of the justice system. These debates, while important, often overshadowed the central issue: the devastating impact of Rojem's crime on Layla's family and the community of Elk City. By the time Rojem faced his third trial in 2007, advancements in forensic science and a deeper understanding of his criminal history left little room for doubt about his guilt. The prosecution once again sought the death penalty, emphasizing the premeditated and brutal nature of the crime. The jury agreed, sentencing him to death for the third time. This verdict marked a turning point, as subsequent appeals were largely unsuccessful, and the legal system began to close in on a final resolution. The trials and appeals process in Rojem's case spanned nearly 4 decades, highlighting the complexities of seeking justice in a capital case. While the repeated retrials and appeals were frustrating for Layla's family and the public, they also underscored the importance of ensuring that the process was thorough and fair, even for someone as clearly guilty as Rojem. In the end, the perseverance of prosecutors, investigators, and Layla's family ensured that justice was not only sought, but ultimately achieved. By 2007, Richard Norman Rojem Jr. had spent over 2 decades on death row, with his conviction for the brutal murder of 7-year-old Layla Cummings having been upheld and overturned multiple times through a series of legal battles. Each appeal seemed to provide him with another opportunity to delay his execution, and each time Layla's family was forced to endure more prolonged anguish and uncertainty. However, the legal roadblocks were beginning to diminish as the case neared a final conclusion. Throughout this extended period, Royam's legal team consistently sought to challenge his conviction and sentence, primarily using arguments about his mental health, the fairness of his trials, and claims that the state's death penalty process was fraught with issues. As a result, his case was repeatedly revisited in the courts, with new motions being filed at various intervals in an attempt to delay his execution. Legal experts debated whether Royam's death sentence was just, considering his troubled mental state and prior convictions for sexual assault. His defense attorneys argued that his psychological problems, including a history of mental illness and a history of trauma, should be considered as mitigating factors, preventing his execution. Over the years, these appeals were met with mixed responses from the court system. Some appeals focused on specific legal technicalities or alleged misconduct during his previous trials. Others raised concerns about his competency to stand trial, suggesting that he was not mentally fit to understand the severity of the charges against him or the consequences of his actions. Despite these claims, the courts continued to uphold his conviction, finding that Royam had been fully aware of his actions and had committed a premeditated crime. The death penalty remained on the table, but the prolonged legal wrangling meant that Royam would remain on death row for many years. Layla's family endured a constant emotional roller coaster during this period. They were forced to relive the pain of their daughter's murder each time the case was reopened in the courts. The relentless legal appeals felt like an additional form of punishment for them, as they were subjected to years of uncertainty and the ongoing hope that Royam's death sentence would finally be carried out. They had already suffered the unimaginable loss of Layla, but now they had to endure the constant back and forth of legal motions and hearings that prevented any sense of closure. For the public, Royam's case became a symbol of the complex nature of the death penalty system in the United States. Legal scholars and activists debated the efficacy and fairness of the death penalty, especially when it came to cases like Royam's. Some believed that his mental health issues should exempt him from execution, while others maintained that the brutal nature of his crime and the clear evidence of his guilt demanded that justice be served without further delay. Royam's case became emblematic of the lengthy and often frustrating process involved in carrying out the death penalty in capital cases. After years of legal delays, the state of Oklahoma finally moved to re-sentence Royam once again in 2007. This time, there would be no more appeals, no more postponements. The courts had grown weary of the continuous challenges to his conviction and sentence, and they were determined to bring the case to a close. At this point, Royam had exhausted most of the avenues for appeal, and the legal system had made its final decision. In 2007, Royam was resentenced to death for the third and final time. This verdict was met with mixed emotions. On one hand, it provided the family with a long overdue sense of justice, knowing that the man who had brutally murdered their daughter would finally face the ultimate consequence. On the other hand, it was bittersweet. For Layla's family, the long journey through the courts had robbed them of the opportunity to grieve fully, and the years of appeals had only added to the emotional strain of their loss. Still, they clung to the belief that this was the final step toward justice, even though they knew Royam's death would not bring back Layla. Royam's final resentencing was a reflection of the justice system's commitment to ensuring that all avenues of appeal were exhausted before carrying out an execution. Despite his many attempts to delay the process, the legal system's decision to move forward with his execution signaled that the courts had reached their breaking point with his case. After years of postponements, the time had come for Royam to face the consequences of his actions. As 2024 arrived, Layla's family was forced to once again brace themselves for the culmination of a decades-long fight for justice. They knew the day was drawing near when Royam would be executed, but it was a bittersweet moment. The many years spent in legal limbo had caused significant emotional strain, and while the finality of the execution might bring some sense of closure, it could never fully heal the wound caused by the murder of their beloved daughter. For them, the death of Royam was not a moment of triumph, but rather the painful conclusion to a tragedy that had haunted their lives for nearly 40 years. The legal journey that began with Layla's death and Roham's arrest finally reached its conclusion in June 2024. After nearly 4 decades of appeals, procedural delays, and legal battles, Roham was led to his final moment. At the age of 66, he was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. For Layla's family, it was a moment of painful closure, as they had been waiting for this moment for nearly 4 decades. Although the execution could never undo the damage done by Roham's actions, it marked the end of a long and tumultuous fight for justice. Roham's final words were brief and emotionless. I've said my goodbyes." His statement, or lack thereof, was a reflection of the man he had been throughout the entire legal process. Apathetic, disconnected, and unmoved by the suffering he had caused. His death marked not only the end of his life, but the final step in a long journey that had begun with an innocent girl's murder and continued through decades of appeals, delays, and legal battles. For Layla's family, Roham's execution was not an event to be celebrated, but a painful acknowledgement that justice had finally been served, albeit far too late. After nearly 4 decades on death row, Richard Norman Roham Jr.'s execution on June 27, 2024, marked the long-awaited closure to a tragic and emotionally exhausting chapter in the lives of Layla Cummings' family and the community of Elk City, Oklahoma. For Layla's loved ones, Roham's death was not a moment of victory, but the painful end to a journey that had begun with the heartbreaking abduction and murder of an innocent child. The years of delays, appeals, and legal battles had taken their toll, and the event that finally brought closure was bittersweet. Roham had been on death row for 39 years, an extraordinary length of time for someone convicted of such a brutal crime. His case had become a symbol of the complexities and flaws within the justice system. From his first conviction in the mid-1980s to his subsequent retrials, appeals, and resentencing, the case dragged on, creating a constant emotional strain for Layla's family. Each time the legal system allowed another appeal or motion, they were forced to relive the grief of losing their daughter, and they were subjected to the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing when or if justice would ever be truly served. Roham's death sentence had been overturned twice before, and each time the legal system appeared to be offering him another chance at life. His defense team repeatedly argued that his mental health issues should exempt him from execution. They claimed that his history of psychological problems and the trauma of his past should be seen as mitigating factors, a justification for reducing his sentence. These prolonged legal battles left Layla's family in a constant state of limbo, waiting for the moment when they could finally begin the healing process. They attended hearings, sat through hours of legal arguments, and watched as the justice system seemed to favor the rights of the convicted man over the rights of a grieving family. Despite the setbacks and frustrations, Layla's family never gave up hope that Roham would eventually be held accountable. They maintained a relentless pursuit of justice, attending every trial, every appeal, and every hearing, determined to ensure that Roham's actions did not go unpunished. For them, the death penalty was a necessary step in ensuring that the man who had taken their precious child's life would never harm anyone again. They never wavered in their belief that no matter how long it took, the law must prevail. In the years leading up to Roham's execution, the public's view on capital punishment in the United States had evolved. As the country engaged in ongoing debates about the morality, fairness, and effectiveness of the death penalty, Roham's case served as an example of the complexities involved. Some people questioned whether such a lengthy time on death row was appropriate for a man whose guilt had been so clear from the start. Others, however, pointed to the need for a careful and deliberate legal process to ensure that the right person was punished, and that the procedures leading to a death sentence were beyond reproach. As the execution date drew closer, Layla's family experienced a mixture of emotions: grief, relief, anger, and sadness. Though they had been fighting for justice for decades, they understood that Roham's death could never bring Layla back. No amount of punishment could undo the damage caused by his brutal crime. They had spent nearly 4 decades living with the absence of their daughter, and no legal resolution could fill the void that she left behind. When June 27, 2024 finally arrived, the day was filled with heavy anticipation and mixed feelings. At the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, Rojam was prepared for his execution by lethal injection, the culmination of a years-long legal battle that had delayed justice for far too long. The prison staff, the legal team, and the media were all present for the event, and outside the walls of the penitentiary, a small group of protesters gathered, some advocating for the abolition of the death penalty, while others expressed their support for Rojam's execution. For Layla's family, the day marked the end of an emotional journey, but it was not the final healing they had hoped for. The wounds of their loss would never fully heal. In the moments leading up to his execution, Rojam was given an opportunity to speak, as is customary for those facing the death penalty. His words, however, were starkly indifferent. When asked if he had any last words, Rojam simply replied, "I don't. I've said my goodbyes." His unemotional response was in keeping with his behavior throughout the entire legal process. Over the years, he had shown little remorse or acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. His detachment and lack of empathy were reflected in his final statement, and it was clear that for all the years spent on death row, he remained a man who had never truly faced the gravity of his actions. Layla's family was present, though it is not known if they were physically inside the execution chamber. Many family members in cases like this choose to remain outside, observing the event from a distance, either through a window or in a separate viewing area. Regardless of their physical proximity to the event, it was undoubtedly a deeply emotional experience for them. The execution brought a sense of finality to their long wait for justice, but it could never erase the pain of losing their daughter. Rojam's execution was the second in Oklahoma in 2024, and it marked the 13th execution since the state resumed capital punishment in 2021, following a brief hiatus. Oklahoma had been at the center of national conversations about the death penalty, particularly due to its use of lethal injection and the controversies surrounding the execution process. For many, Rojam's death marked the closing of a painful chapter not just for his victims but for the state itself. The aftermath of Rojam's execution left many with mixed emotions. For some, it was a necessary closure to a decades-long ordeal. For others, it was a tragic reminder of the immense suffering that the justice system at times fails to prevent. Layla's family, after all the years of fighting and waiting, would never fully find peace. Their daughter's death, and the decades of legal battles that followed, had left scars that no legal decision could heal. Still, they were able to find some solace in the fact that the man who had taken Layla's life would never harm another person. In the end, Rojam's execution marked the conclusion of a legal odyssey that had stretched over nearly 4 decades. The process had been exhausting, and for Layla's family, the emotional toll had been immense. But despite the immense pain of losing their daughter, they had never wavered in their belief that justice would eventually be served. Though Rojam's death could never replace the loss of Layla, it offered them a sense of closure that had long been denied. For them, the healing process could begin, not because Rojam was dead, but because they could finally begin to lay to rest the tragic memory of the man who had stolen their child's future.